Hello everyone and welcome back to the Cyclocross Social Podcast. Today I'm here with Twan to discuss another week of exciting racing on the road. Welcome Twan.
Hello.
Last week our main topic was of course the comeback of Mathieu van der Poel in Milaan-San Remo, but this week there is no way around it. We need to talk about his counterpart both on the road and in cyclocross, Wout van Aert. We had the E3 Harelbeke on Friday and man, what a display there by Wout van Aert and basically his entire team of Jumbo-Visma, ripping the race apart on the Taaienberg, and then an attack on the Paterberg by Wout van Aert was only answered by his teammate Christophe Laporte. The two stayed together over the Oude Kwaremond and the Karnemelk-Bekerstraat. They went together over the Varent, and then eventually in Harelbeke it was Van Aert who was allowed to take the win by Laporte, or well, allowed. It was definitely well deserved because Van Aert was clearly the strongest there, and I mean, wow, what a difference between 1 week. Such a performance where in Milaan-San Remo it didn't look that great. Here, completely a different world.
Yeah, it was an absolutely stellar performance by Jumbo-Visma, a repeat of what they did basically in Paris-Nice, this time without Roglic though, as Wout van Aert and Christophe Laporte took it on together. Just amazing that they are able to do that kind of thing and just keep on gaining on the group behind, and eventually I think the group behind just had to give up because it's two teammates working out front together, they have one goal, so it's really hard to actually catch back up with them. And even in the group behind they had Tiesj Benoot playing a role there as well for them. It was just an all-round insane performance from Jumbo-Visma with 4 riders in the top 12.
Yeah, I mean, just so strong, and we don't really know any insights of his training schedule, but if I were to speculate, I would think that just before the Milaan-San Remo weekend, he put in some training after Paris-Nice, because if I remember correctly, around the time of Omloop and Nieuwsblad, they said that they were going to do some specific training after Paris-Nice to be in peak condition for the Tour of Flanders. So I think that maybe was it. Hard week of racing in Paris-Nice, bit of training afterwards, bit of tiredness in San Remo, because for a sponsor like Jumbo, these Belgian classics are more important than Milaan-San Remo, and their main goal is at the end of the day to win the Tour of Flanders and Paris-Roubaix.
And of course he has already won Milaan-San Remo, and he has neither a Ronde or a Roubaix on his palmarès yet.
Yeah, I think overall it was just nothing you could do about it. I mean, we can still speak a bit about what was happening there at the finish. We saw that they went over the line together. So some people say that they would have preferred to see them race. How do you see that? Should Van Aert have raced against Laporte, potentially trying to drop him or at least sprint for the win?
I think it would have been funny. Probably you have the same outcome, but at least you create the illusion of there having been a race. And it was the weirdest millimeter sprint I have ever seen. But yeah, at the end, Wout van Aert probably wins it regardless. But we could have maybe seen a bit more of a show, although at the end of the day, I think just tiredness-wise, just small efforts, it is just better to take it easy those final few kilometers.
I think the difficulty is that where do you draw this line? Is it just going to be a sprint and just cooperate until the line there? Or is it a pure race? Because we saw already on the Kwaremond that it was Van Aert who was waiting a bit on Laporte. And if Van Aert needs to go solo from the Kwaremond, I'm not entirely sure that he makes it, because behind, yes, okay, they eventually get a gap of 2 minutes, but they have a very big gain in terms of the mental power that you get if they catch Laporte and then Van Aert is alone. So who knows what could have happened there then. So I think that eventually this was the best outcome, and a sprint, well, it could have been fun, but in my opinion it would always have been somewhat fake, or at least not really a real sprint. If Laporte would have been on a different team, I think it would have been super exciting to see these two riders go for it, and then potentially a longer Wout van Aert solo that had more chances to fail, but definitely something that is interesting to discuss, but overall I think Van Aert was simply the strongest, and that was demonstrated again today on the Kemmelberg by an attack there. I think he came from about 15th position and then eventually stormed to the front. Only a couple of riders were able to follow him, including again Laporte. I think Pedersen was also there and maybe 2 other riders, but yeah, overall I think there's no way around it. Next week in Tour of Flanders, Wout van Aert is the top favorite.
Yeah, he has to be. He's been absolutely amazing during this classic season, and he's confirmed it in the most important races.
We could talk long or short about how strong Van Aert was, but I think we've made it pretty clear that we were impressed by him. I think he's the top favorite for the Tour of Flanders. But there were more cyclocross riders who put in pretty impressive rides this weekend. For instance, Tim Merlier, Gent Wevelgem, a pretty difficult classic. He ended 6th there, winning the sprint of the peloton behind the 4 leaders and the chaser Søren Kragh Andersen. I think that was also impressive because personally I had my doubts if he would make it over the Kemmelberg, but then to do that, I mean, okay, he was dropped, but that makes it, in my opinion, even more impressive. He had a long chase, needed to pace in that himself, then eventually came back and then won the sprint from that group. I was pretty impressed by that.
Yeah, I was happily surprised to see him there. Of course, it had been quite a tough race, and to see him up there in such a tough classic, it's good to see for sure. And then winning the sprint, just unfortunate that they weren't really able to get enough together to actually reel in the breakaway, but still good to see him, of course. But of course, not quite as good as his performance in Brugge Panne, where he actually did manage to take the victory.
Yeah, we'll speak about that in a second. First, I would like to go back to Gent Wevelgem. In Gent Wevelgem, there was, of course, these 4 leaders: Girmay, Stuyve, Van Gestel, and Laporte. In the peloton, there were 3 riders from Alpecin: Gianni Vermeersch, Jasper Philipsen, and Tim Merlier. Philips and Merlier for quite a while just sat there doing nothing, and then eventually there was, I think, maybe 1 pull by Philips or maybe even none. That was pretty weird because at some point it looked like they had a real opportunity of catching these attackers again, but eventually it just stopped because the domestiques were empty and there was nobody left to chase. If I was Merlier, I would be fuming with Philipsen because Vermeersch did an awful lot of work for him, but Philipsen, of course he's a sprinter, but he didn't really help Merlier in any way possible, whilst Philipsen was arguably the stronger of the 2, considering he came over the Kemmelberg first.
Yeah, I think definitely disappointing. As a teammate, you would hope that everyone has like the best interest of the team at heart. Maybe Philipsen felt hard done by. I always think that like if you have 2 people there and there's a gap that needs to be closed, and both are about equal in sprinting ability, you use the one that was the best throughout the previous part of the race to actually close the gap, because that definitely needs to happen. And then the sprinting, they're pretty much similar, so I think by opposite it was the right call, but yeah, it might just have been something that the Philipsen didn't agree with, which I can also very much understand.
Yeah, and that could be possible, but still it's not really good for the chemistry, and it's, in my opinion, also weird that Alpecin, they really like to bring Merlier and Philipsen to races together. We saw it in the Tour last year as well, where in my opinion Merlier was the faster of the 2 at that point. Now I would say they are equal, but every time they sprinted there with Philipsen because Merlier already won a stage, I still believe that that was a mistake there. Merlier eventually dropped out early, leaving them with only Philipsen to go for, but I think that it's just weird to bring 2 of these top class sprinters to the Grand Tours. For this year, again, the program is to bring Merlier to the Giro and then bring both to the Tour. The rumor is also that Van der Poel is going to the Tour and they want Van der Poel to target the green jersey. Personally, I struggle how all of this is going to fit in a picture. I struggle to see that because you can't be having Merlier and Philips rotating for sprints with Van Aert in a lead-out train, but at the same time wanting Van der Poel, not Van Aert, with Van der Poel going for the green jersey. It just doesn't really make sense, in my opinion, how all of this is going to fit together.
Yeah, it's very interesting team building indeed, with objectives of like every single rider in there. Jonas Rickaert is going to be a very busy man, having to launch 3 guys at the same time.
Yeah, and that obviously won't happen, and we know that the transfer rumor mill is turning in overtime at this point of the season. We've seen speculation that people say that Quickstep want to make a move on Turgy. Not really sure how accurate that is, but we know that both the contracts of Philipsen and Merlier are ending. Do you then think that a team like Quickstep, who have a Cavendish who this season isn't at the same level he was last year, Cavendish is also getting old, team that always wants to have two top tier sprinters, that then Quickstep will approach either Philipsen or Merlier to try and get them on board? And of course, with the cyclocross part coming there as well, especially Merlier could be an interesting signing for a team like Quickstep to also sign a big name for the cross.
Yeah, I think both are very interesting targets, and I think there is definitely a balance between age and also the cyclocross part that both teams are going to have to consider. Because especially I think if they are going to send both to the Tour de France again, you're just not going to keep both of them happy, because at this point I think both of them think that they are at least like a top 5 sprinter in the world, and rightfully so. So having them do lead-outs for each other in the Tour de France really isn't going to work for either of them, I would hope. And it looks logical to me that they are going to have to let one go.
Yeah, I would indeed think so. Also considering the fact that I can imagine both riders wanting a raise in wage after the results that they got. Of course, we know Alpecin has quite a lot of money. Apparently, they pay Van der Poel €2.5 million per year, which is still relatively okay for a rider of that caliber. It's, for instance, a bit less than Wout van Aert earns, but besides the financial part, I think that it's just a bit hard to see this. It kind of reminds me of back in the day when you had Argos Shimano. They had Kittel and Degenkolb, both two sprinters that were top 10 in the world. It was clear that Kittel was the better of the two. They used Degenkolb in the lead-out train, where Degenkolb then wasn't the lead-out guy, because, as you said, two fast sprinters leading out each other won't work. If Philipsen leads out Merlier, Philipsen kills Merlier. The other way around, the same happens. Degenkolb could still be used earlier in the sprint train, as he was good in long efforts. I fail to see a role like that for Philipsen or Merlier, because both seem pretty explosive sprinters, so I struggle to see them do like a turn from 3 to 1k to go or something like that. So I would indeed agree with you, Twan, that it would be logical that one of these two goes to another team, and if that's Quickstep or another team is something time will prove. Personally, I think Quickstep will be very interested in trying to sign Merlier, because, as said, with their newly founded cross team, it would be pretty good to have Merlier come on board there on January 1st. I can, however, imagine that Alpecin doesn't want to let Merlier go. They are happy with what he does in the cross, they are happy with what he does in the road, and we saw it in the Brugge de Panne Classic, which is basically taking over the role of the Scheldeprijs as World Championships for sprinters. Pretty much all sprinters except Ewan and Jacobsen were there. Groenewegen was there. Groenewegen was beaten by Merlier in a pretty close sprint. And this is one of the days that it did come together for Merlier. He did have decent support, no Philipsen around him, and then he is able to sprint to the win in a highly contested sprint, which was very impressive.
Yeah, I think it was really nice to see. Of course, in Tirreno, we saw that Alpecin had some issues positioning Merlier, and with how narrow some of the roads are in Brugge de Panne, I saw that happening again. But in the end, Merlier in a good position and was able to convert it into a victory against some of the best sprinters in the world.
Yeah, definitely impressive by him, as said. In recent races, we have also seen an improvement in form of one of his other teammates. We were pretty skeptical about the form of Gianni Vermeersch, but in Adrie Harelbeke and especially Gent Wevelgem, he showed that his form is definitely improving a bit. What did you make of his races?
I was happy to see that he actually managed to stay with it longer and managed to contribute to the team, get himself an okay result in E3 as well. And hopefully it's just in time for Ronde.
Yeah, and in the Ronde we will see another strong rider lining up of the Alpecin Phoenix team. Mathieu van der Poel went to race in the Coppi at Bartali. What did he do there this week, Twan?
He went for stage victories rather than for the overall classification, which is very logical. If you had a look at the parkour, there was quite some climbing there. In the end, he managed to win in the fourth stage, where he went on the attack in the descent, was caught again by the peloton after a solo of I think more than 50 kilometers, and then went on to win the sprint in the peloton. So I'm sure he had a lot of fun. Also managed a fourth place on the first stage.
Definitely impressive ride by Van der Poel there, especially on that stage he won in the Coppi Bartali. I do think that Hayter lost that stage. I mean, Hayter started to sprint with 600 meters to go apparently, and then Van der Poel could easily pass him, but nevertheless I think he used this as good training, and I expect him to be at the front in the Ronde van Vlaanderen, which is next week. I'm really looking forward to that. We'll probably attend that one together with Tom as well, so I think that should be very great.
Also, a quick mention for two-time world champion in the juniors, Ben Tullet, who managed a second place in the overall in Coppi Bartali, climbing very strongly throughout the week, and I think also taking a stage on the third day.
Let's then go and talk about the women's races of this week. There was no women's Adrie Harelbeke, but there was, however, women's Gent Wevelgem, and there once again we saw some cyclocross riders do impressive stuff. Shirin van Anrooij continued her trend of the last couple of weeks, mainly working for Elisa Balsamo, who secured the victory. I think that Shirin van Anrooij might have lost the lead in the youth Women's World Tour. That one, I think, goes to another cyclocross rider, Sylvia Persico, but you can correct me if I'm wrong on that one, Twan.
No, she actually loses the place to Georgie Pfeiffer, who has the same points as her, but takes it on the tiebreaker.
Well, I think that's a bit of a bummer, but there's still quite some races to go, and arguably the ones that suit Van Anrooij better are still to come. Really looking forward to that. I think for the rest we see a continuation of the trend that Sylvia Persico is doing well, ends 9th here in a mass sprint in Gent Wevelgem, also ended in the top 10 of the massed sprint in the Brugge de Panne Classic. World champion cyclocross ended 2nd, Marianne Vos. Let's talk about that for a bit. The world champion cyclocross ending 2nd in her second race of the season, beaten by Balsamo. What did you make of her sprint? Was it the best possible sprint for her?
It was very impressive for sure. After a tough race, of course, Vos is in a better position to sprint against the likes of Elisa Balsamo. Unfortunately, just like we saw at the World Championship, she couldn't quite beat her, but very respectable indeed, beating out some very impressive sprinters in their own right in Kopecky, Norsgaard and Bastianelli.
Yeah, definitely. I think that on a pure flat sprint like this, it's always going to be for Balsamo. And I think even like we saw at the Worlds, if it's a bit uphill, Balsamo will also be potentially a bit better. But if we have finishes like Strade Bianchi and the bit tougher races like we'll see in the Amstel Gold Race, then I'm personally favoring Marianne Vos a bit. Of course, it's still only her second race of the season, so I think her form is still building a bit. Don't necessarily know what her goal is going to be, but I assume that will be the Ronde van Vlaanderen, but even more Paris-Roubaix. I think that's correct, that should be her main goal, right?
I'm not sure what she's actually doing, but I imagine that Paris-Roubaix is, of course, the one thing that's missing from her palmarès, as well as Strade Bianchi. So she'll be making a target out of that, I would hope.
Yeah, I would imagine so. So I think that's indeed what she's working towards. And then, of course, also a goal of her is the Tour de France Femmes, which is happening this summer. Also looking forward to that race. Mention here, sprinter that's missing in the top 10, Lorena Wiebes, did a number of cyclocross races this winter, which was fun to see. Even made the broadcast in Kortrijk. She had a mechanical and I think even a crash, and then eventually was gone, which was unfortunate, but it did leave opportunities for a couple of other riders. Personally, I was very impressed by the rides of the Planeta Pura riders. Sanne Cant and Jara Kastelijn both made it over the final time Kemmelberg. Cant eventually sprinted to an 11th place despite being boxed in. We know Cant is a pretty good sprinter, but 11th here, and I mean, arguably missing out on an 8th place here due to being locked in and being in a hustle, no lead out. Did you expect that?
To be honest, I was already quite surprised to see that she was all the way up in the first group. I think that's quite impressive and just something to be very happy with. And for her to sprint to an 11th place, it's really nice to see. And hopefully she can continue this form. It was really surprising, actually, to me, yeah.
Yeah, she was pretty good on that Kemmelberg as well. And, I mean, we know that last year she ended 5th in a stage of the Norway Tour. And that was in a sprint, so she was 4th in that sprint because there was one leader. It was pretty impressive to see that she then ends 11th here, and that said, just misses out on the top 10. But overall, the way of riding by Planeta Pura was pretty impressive. We saw a decently strong Julie de Wilde as well. Yeah, Kastelijn moving on attacks and stuff. Unfortunately for Kastelijn, she just lacks racing experience. She had a crash. It was a pretty silly crash because there was this thing in the middle of the road and it got a bit squeezy, and then she eventually, I think, hits the deck due to just braking too hard. It was a bit hard to see what happened there, but it was a silly crash, and also the attack she reacted to wasn't necessarily the smartest. But I mean, we said it earlier as well, I'm excited to see what she can do on the more hilly courses. I mean, looking at the Ardennes, also looking at some more mountain races, for instance Giro Rossa. No indication if she will race that, but those races I'm really looking forward to see what she can do there, because I think the pure power is there. What do you think she can do next week in the Tour of Flanders or maybe in the Ardennes Classics?
Yeah, Tour of Flanders might just be a race that suits her a bit more. And she might just be like an outsider for a good top 10 placing. Of course, you saw some of it already in Strade Bianche, so that is certainly encouraging.
I personally think that if she has a really good day and everything falls together, that the top 10 or for sure top 15 should be possible in the Tour of Flanders. I think she's made steps compared to racing last year in the Spring Classics. But last year in the Tour of Flanders, she was already looking on track for a top 17 result until she had a nasty crash on the top of the Oude Kwaremond. So I think this year an improvement on what should have been a top 17 should be possible. Top 15, top 10 is indeed what I will be looking at. But at the end, Kastelijn lacks a sprint, so that could be a bit of some downside that she not necessarily needs to work on, because I just think she's the type of rider for that, but could be a bit of a bottleneck for her. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you see it with riders like, if you look, for example, in the men's peloton, you have Stefan Kung, like quite a good rider in his own right, but it's just hard. If you get in a group and you can't quite drop them, then you're not going to win the sprint. That is pretty much for sure. And I think that's just something that Yara Kastelijn will have to deal with, and hope that she can elevate her game to the likes of Annemiek van Vleuten and just ride everyone off the wheel.
I mean, getting to the level of Van Vleuten will be difficult, but of course, you can aim high, and I will definitely be watching her with a close eye next week in the Tour of Flanders. I think we've had it then in terms of cyclocross riders. Is there anything you would like to end this podcast with?
Not really.
Well, then I'll do it. I will make an exception here. Instead of only focusing on cyclocross, I would like to take a moment to appreciate the history we've seen witnessed today in the men's Gent Wevelgem, where Guillermai took the win, becoming the first African winner of a cycling classic, and not just a classic, it's Gent Wevelgem, one of the oldest and most prestigious classics. So yeah, definitely something to remember altogether. And we'll be looking forward to the races next week. We have the Tour of Flanders, or as we say here, Ronde van Vlaanderen coming up. Definitely looking forward to that race. Twan, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me on.
And we'll be back next week with a new podcast. See you guys then. Goodbye.